Thank you all so much for taking the time to be here today as we are rapidly approaching spring break. I know this is such a busy week for people, so it really means a lot that you are here today at 3:30 p.m. on a Thursday. Today's presentation is brought to you by the Carolina Community Coalition here at USC, where we bring partners together to reduce high-risk student behavior through policy, systems, and environmental strategies. Over the past year and a half or so, bystander intervention has been a topic of concern for the coalition, and we've been working to pull partners together to develop some shared language to talk about bystander intervention across spectrum of topics. So we've had folks that work in the areas of interpersonal violence, substance misuse, mental health, academic integrity, hazing, and discrimination, which is going to be the focus of today. We are really excited to welcome Dr. Roth and Dr. Wu to share their research with us. It's always great to be able to host folks from our own campus here and hear about the great work that's being done in our own community. They're going to share their research focused on the factors that influence a bystander's decision to intervene when they witness anti-Asian discrimination. And as we get started, you can feel free to go ahead and use the chat box to introduce yourself or ask questions as we get going. And I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Roth and Dr. Wu before we get started. Ben Roth, PhD, studies immigration and social stratification, focusing on youth and barriers to mobility. His research examines immigrants serving schools, human service organizations, and precarious legal status in the U.S. He holds degrees from Hunter College and the University of Chicago. Bongki Wu, PhD, is an associate professor at the University of South Carolina College of Social Work. He studies the social determinants of mental health of people of color, especially Asian Americans. His primary focus is to understand specific conditions where social stressors, like discrimination, explain the relationships between race, ethnicity, and mental health. Thank you all so much for being here today, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. And you should be able to share your screen.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Jimmy. Let me first share my screen. Okay, so I just shared my screen. Can everyone see screen?
Yep.
Just trying to navigate this share screen option. Um, so thank you very much for the introduction, Jana. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bongki. I'm one of the co-presenter of this talk. Dr. Roth and I welcome you to this session about anti-Asian racial discrimination and bystander intervention. Um, I'd like to first thank the Carolina Community Coalition for this opportunity, so we can share our work with you. And I'd also like to thank you all for being here to do this talk. So in today's talk, I would like to first talk about the state of anti-Asian discrimination by discussing some brief history and data related to anti-Asian discrimination. And then we'll introduce our research project on the topic of bystander intervention against anti-Asian discrimination. So, violent anti-Asian discrimination and hate crimes have been dramatically surged during the recent pandemic a few years ago. And this topic has received a lot of public attention since then. But anti-Asian racism and discrimination are new social phenomena in us. Historically, Asian Americans have faced xenophobia and racism. So I'd like to first introduce you some common biases against Asian and Asian Americans that are manifest in the forms of like migration, discrimination, and racism. So Asian Americans have been casted as habitual criminals, regardless of where they were born, or longer stayed in the US. They also have been seen as modern minorities that assumes that they are universally competent, successful, hardworking, and yet submissive and problem-free. So this like modern minority myth has fostered that Asian Americans are basically immune to racism. They cannot experience racial discrimination and it cannot be that severe. So this is really harmful, especially in the context of bystander intervention, because it grounds bystanders to recognize it as a problem and detect its harmful effects. And also, although there are more than like 35 Asian countries where Asians are coming from, there's invalidation of like interactive diversity, differences, and religions. So these are some common like, biases that again can turn into many forms of hateful acts, including discrimination. Dr. Roth, I will introduce some history of infection in CCC.
Thanks, Bongki. Bongki, in your audio is a little funky. Yeah, I don't know why. Is that true, Jenna? Are you having a hard time hearing it too, or is it just on my end?
Yeah, it's kind of coming in and out a little bit.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll try it without this headset thing.
Yeah. Why don't you try
That
that?
might work.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks.
Um, and we thought it's important, really, for this talk, especially, just to locate the conversation about anti-Asian discrimination in just briefly in the larger history of how Asian Americans have experienced the United States. And this is a cartoon from the late 1800s, and you can see it's called The Great Fear of the Period. This is where it says that Uncle Sam may be swallowed by foreigners. And so you have depicted in the cartoon a really garish illustration of an Irish immigrant and a supposedly a Chinese immigrant on the right. In the background, you can see railroads that are snaking through a map of the United States as the country continues to expand. And in the final frame there, you can see that there's like a melding of the two immigrants as Uncle Sam is consumed altogether. So there was a lot of anti-Asian discrimination and racist treatment in this period. And it led to the Chinese Exclusionary Act in the late 1800s, a gentleman's agreement for Japanese Americans in the early 1900s, essentially restricting immigration flow from these countries. And then, of course, we have the bombing of Pearl Harbor in the midst of World War II, which prompted the U.S. government to begin rounding up Japanese Americans around the country and forcibly moving them to detention camps. And this is a picture of one of the biggest ones. And you can obviously this was children and families. These weren't people who had been proven to be at all threats to the country or its national security, but a reactive response. And so this kind of action we think is just emblematic of the longer history of how Asian Americans at different points, punctuated by certain evolving historical moments, have really been in the crosshairs of hate speech and really of violent acts.
Thank you, God. Can you all hear me okay?
That's better. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for letting me know. So as many of you know, there have been lots of violent attacks targeting Asians in the US during the COVID-19. Like this slide just summarizes a few instances. So in one instance in Texas, a man used a stick knife to slash an Asian man and his 6 and 2-year-old children inside a Sam's Club because he believed that they were his family were from China and like the spread of COVID virus, COVID. So the victim, the Kung family, his father of the Kung family later said that even after the attack, like I don't care, I'm proud of being Asian and Asian American. But like his family, I mean, were severely influenced by like this incident, like cannot walk through any store without constantly looking around. And his 6-year-old son is now cannot move one eyebrow, and he is afraid of like sleeping alone. And also in another instance, as many of you may remember, like 6 Asian American women working in spa were murdered in the Atlanta area by shootings. So there were like many instances that literally cost people's life during the COVID pandemic. So I'd like to share some like recent data like from Stop AAPI Hate in 2024. Stop AAPI Hate, by the way, is an organization that has collected data of anti-Asian hate and like discrimination incidents since the COVID pandemic. So according to this report, over half of Asian American and Pacific Islanders experienced some form of hateful incidents due to their race in 2024. So it's not like lifetime instance. It happened, they report that it happened in 2024. And this rate is comparable to like 49% of reports in the previous year's report, like 2023. So like constantly, we are seeing that it doesn't decrease, it actually like rather like increased. And another notable thing was that like young adults whose age was like between 18 to 29 years old, like they can report the most frequent incidents. Like 72% of them report that they have experienced some like hateful acts. And like among these like hateful like acts, it included like harassment and institutional discrimination and so forth. To give you some sense like what these incidents look like, I got some quotes from this report. A Filipino woman from California said, "Oh, I was biking and another biker yelled anti-Asian rhetoric at me and another biker for several blocks. They referred to us as a piece of shit, getting in their way, and that and said that your kind should go back to China." In another instance, a woman from Tennessee reported that, "Oh, my manager denied my application for an assistant manager job and publicly stated that it was based on my race. I reported this incident to HR, but they retaliated against me." And in another instance, a woman from California said, "A man physically assaulted me on my bed, and his female partner came into my face and said, 'People like you should go back to where you came from.'" So these are some instances that's been reported to this like national report, and it comes with some consequences to the victims or the targets. So discrimination can be really bad for like the target people's mental health and health, more so than people can realize. So according to the same report from Study 8, overall, like 40% of Asians who experienced this like hateful instance reported that it negatively influenced their mental health or health. And also, in addition to that, many of them experience that they have like lower sense of belonging. They like they were being more like vigilant, so they had to like learn more about like their safety and so on. And research shows that racial discrimination, no matter how like explicit or like subtle it is, has harmful consequences. So many research shows that, including mine, shows that it negatively influences mental health, physical health, substance abuse, suicidal thoughts. It also connects to less access to healthcare. And also studies have also found that the indirect exposure to discrimination is also really harmful, that negatively influences people's mental health. So even if you're not directly targeted, still the vicarious exposure to discrimination can be really harmful for the targets too. Despite really like these harmful effects of discrimination, support for Asian Americans have been relatively low. So according to this report from Pew Research Center in 2021, majority of like over 70% of adults in the US acknowledge that there's a lot or at least some discrimination against Asians. But despite that rate, only about a third of Asian American adults report that someone reached out to express support for them. So this kind of like relatively low support for Asian Americans really motivates me to study this topic on bystander intervention. So now I'd like to introduce our work about work with Dr. Roth on bystander intervention against anti-Asian discrimination. This work has been published in American Journal of Clinical Psychology in 2025. Um, so this qualitative study explored why non-Asian American bystanders decide to intervene when they witness anti-Asian discrimination and why, and under other circumstances, other situations, they decide not to intervene.
So we lay out in the paper what everyone on this call is very familiar with, I assume, which is what does it mean to be a bystander? And but for those who may not, pictured here is an article from 1964 with a headline talking about 37 who saw a murder. This happened in Queens of Kitty Genevieve's didn't call the police, and this was a moment that it was actually 38, not 37. There's been some critique of this article and how it's headlined. In fact, some people did call the police. One woman actually went to Kitty Genevieve's side. So some of this has been challenged. But what happened is a question, how could so many people witness such an atrocious act and not intervene? So in the public outcry actually following this headline, the event, is widely credited with accelerating the creation of a national 911 emergency system. And in the field of social psychology, it sparked an exploration of behavior, human behavior. Why would a large group of people fail to act in an emergency? So if you can go to the next slide, please, Bongki. This leads us then to the framework that we used that was introduced by Latané and Darley in 1970. So this is fast forward another 5 years or so after the murder of Genevieve's. And these psychologists were actually kind of skeptical of the media's explanation that witnesses are simply apathetic or morally decayed. So they set about the task of trying to figure out whether we can look beyond a categorization of bystanders as either being good or bad people to better understand how a given situation, right, introduces a set of dynamics and factors over which sometimes the bystander has no control that may help us, when analyzed a little bit more carefully, better understand why some people choose to intervene while others do not. So these authors lay out 5 different steps, and we wanted to introduce them to you here with a little bit more attention because they end up being the scaffolding for our entire study that we wrote. Essentially, they outline these 5 different steps that they say are often part of that bystander intervention. And again, people on the call, I'm sure, are very familiar with them. But it allowed us to enter into an analysis of our own data with a pretty clear framework. So first, bystanders have to notice the event. You've got to be aware that something's happening and that it's unusual. If you're distracted or if you're in a hurry, right, there are all kinds of reasons. If you're in a crowded environment, there are all kinds of reasons why you may not actually even get past that first step of noticing the event. Number 2, you've got to interpret the situation as an as an emergency. So not only must you notice the event, recognize it as unusual, but you must categorize it in your own mind as something that is an emergency. There can be a lot of ambiguity as bystanders are witness to a given event. And the authors talk about this idea of pluralistic ignorance, where you look around and you see that no one else is doing anything. So it might lead you to choose not to proceed to the next step here yourself, which is number 3, assume personal responsibility. So at this step, the individual has to believe that it is their duty to do something. They must believe that it is incumbent upon them to respond. And again, there can be this diffusion of responsibility where in one's own mind as a bystander, you think, oh, well, maybe someone else is going to respond here. I'm not going to be the first to do something. Step 4, once you get past that, is actually knowing how to help. So a bystander can sometimes experience what the authors refer to as bystander paralysis, where you see something, you recognize it as an emergency, you determine that it's your job to do something about, but you don't know what to do. And then step 5 is implementing, actually doing something. So this is the final step. So it can be stopping the event. It can be an indirect intervention by, say, calling for help. So these are the 5 steps. Bongki?
So previous research suggests that bystander intervention can promote intolerance, injustice like racism or sexism as a social norm. The previous research suggests that bystander intervention can potentially reduce the biased attitudes and behaviors of the perpetrators and provide support for the targeted groups. So, for example, it sends a message that the biased comments or behaviors are not supported. And it also can provoke feelings of guilt from the perpetrators, and it can also reduce the perpetrators' prejudices. And it also can restore the target group members' safety and their sense of belonging. The targeted group members' bystander action, however, so in this case, bystander intervention, if it taken by other Asian races, can be more likely to be perceived as an overreaction or complaint compared to non-targeted groups, like non-targeted bystanders confrontation. So studies suggest that bystander intervention can be especially effective if the bystander is coming from a non-target group. So intervention made by dominant or non-stigmatized groups can like surprise the perpetrator or enhance the persuasive in their messages. Because perpetrators tend to perceive non-target groups confrontation as more persuasive. And also intervention taken by other marginalized groups can increase the sense of solidarity, and it can also provide sense of hope for the targets. So bystander intervention taken by individuals who are not from Asian or like racial backgrounds can be especially helpful to address racial biases and discrimination against them. So when no action is taken and people remain silent in the face of discrimination, it can cause pain, suffering to targets, and it also can bring guilt in the mind of like other bystanders who are in the situation. And it also can basically create this like false consensus that discrimination is basically okay. So to this end, this study like we explored why non-Asian bystanders decide to intervene when they witness anti-Asian discrimination, and also why under some other situations they choose not to intervene. We conducted 20 semi-structured qualitative interviews with non-Asian students at our university at WSC who have witnessed anti-Asian discrimination in the past. So this interview was conducted in like 2022, and we asked each respondent to share one instance when they intervened and another instance when they did not intervene. we analyzed our data by the five-stage sequential decision-making framework that Ben described and explained earlier. Here, share the results.
So we wanted to start actually with just a quick example of some of the stories that we heard. And I think it might be worth noting, Bongki, that just to remind folks that we talked to people who are reporting to us as bystanders an event that they saw, which they decided in which they decided to intervene or in which they decided not to. We did not speak to the victims of the scenario or the perpetrators. Here's an example of what we heard. This is a white respondent at work who talks about responding to verbal harassment from a customer against their employer. Basically, their employer was an Asian woman who owned the restaurant, and a customer comes in and is told that he's going to have to wait for his table, and the wait is long. It ends up being an hour, and the customer gets so frustrated that he stands up and yells, "I want to talk to the owner of the restaurant." He's presented with the owner of the restaurant, who is an Asian woman, and the customer insists that there's no way that an Asian could own this restaurant. And so the person we were talking to, the respondent, then described how they stood up for their boss, and this is what they said: "I stood up for my boss at multiple points," in this scenario that they described, being like, "Hey, she's the owner, she's the authority here." I think that felt good to keep referring back to this is her power. Don't take it away from her. Again, this is the respondent describing his response. The customer ended up throwing his beer against the wall and storming out of the restaurant. So this is an example of the kinds of stories that we heard from bystanders who described what they saw, and then allowed us then to think through the various steps that may have helped us better understand what led them to intervene or not. So one way that we can present these findings, if we think of this step 2, right? So we're assuming that they actually saw the incident. So step 2 here is where they identify the situation as intervention appropriate. So you can see the little map on the right where it's going to walk us through step by step. And as we heard stories from respondents relaying to us what it was that was a situation that they were trying to determine whether this is an intervention appropriate moment. You can see that sometimes they're looking at the victim's behaviors here. And we're using the term victim here consistent with the theory that we've used as a framework for our project. One respondent says you could see the personal effect it had, which was a comment made to someone based on their Asian identity. Like with my friend, I could see his discomfort. I could see it was upsetting and that it kind of hurt. There were many times when this was visible. However, sometimes it's not quite as obvious, where the person who they're observing doesn't necessarily present with any kind of visible behavior that suggests that they are uncomfortable. So another respondent, for instance, discussed how the person who was the joke, you can see, was they were laughing as they were even being made fun of for their Asian identity. And so that makes it more difficult, according to our respondents, to really interpret, all right, well, is this something that rises to the level of being an urgent issue that needs intervention? Bystanders talked about being very uncomfortable in these moments. One respondent said, "I think the largest incident that I still remember was when I brought my Asian boyfriend home and my dad made a joke because my boyfriend had a stereotypically white name. And my dad and then my family were making jokes about, like, no, what's your real name?" And my boyfriend was just kind of laughing and going along with it. So these kinds of ambiguities can really make it difficult to go from step 2 to step 3. Bongki? Actually, let me talk about whether the victim is present or not. Um, Clearly, another factor here is whether the person is even there. As you can imagine, at times the respondents told us of incidents when the victim wasn't even in the room, that they were being talked about, and the question was, "Is this a moment when I speak up?" And for instance, one respondent said, "Maybe it makes me a little bit more apathetic when someone isn't around. That's a direct target." Where it's easier to dissociate from that, maybe rightfully, unrightfully so. I definitely think that when there's somebody around that's directly experiencing injustice, it's easier for me to gain that spark of whatever. I'll repeat myself, I don't care. I'll yell it from the top of the world if I've got to. Stop treating my friends wrong. When they are in the room, it makes a difference. Um, Other people said the opposite. I mean, it was striking how like there was it was very difficult to identify like clear patterns in this way. And yeah, maybe I'll stop there with that point. Punky.
Thank you, Ben. So, among those who arrive to the next step, the step three, which is to take the responsibility to the action, we found that moral obligation to do the right thing was the key catalyst that helped the respondents to move towards the next step, step four. So the respondents who arrived to this like step three and end up moving to the next step often used is like value-driven languages such as was right and fair. It just didn't feel right for the perpetrator to call the victim that way, or what he said was wrong. Others also explained that this was driven by the rule of treating others as we would like to be treated. So one respondent intervened because the target or the victim was so defenseless. If I was in their shoes, I wouldn't want that happening to me. The bystanders who have a relationship with the victim or the perpetrators were more likely to feel some kind of like responsibility to take action. One respondent said, "Oh, and we weren't really friends, but like we would have sometimes sit together for lunch, stuff like that. And since like I've sat with this sat with this girl who was the victim multiple times for lunch, I felt like I needed to defend her because I've talked to her before." Another respondent said, "Oh, I did feel a lot more comfortable, and I didn't notice in the usual for quite a while. And so I knew what would happen, and I knew how he, the perpetrator, would react if I respond, if I intervene." So, but like some bystanders chose not to intervene because they did not have any relationships with either the perpetrator or the victim. Um, but so one African American interviewee who visited the restaurant with her family decided to intervene when she noticed that the perpetrator, whom she doesn't know, who shared the same racial background. So she said, overall, the guy behind me who was in the comments was another Black person. And I just remember things like, "Oh, why did you do that? Because there's so no stigma around us anyway. And then when we get into this nice stage, and things of that nature. And like, the way they view us, like, the way they already put these stereotypes on us. And for you to just go ahead and do that, you're part of the problem. So the overall relational connections do seem to have some important aspects of like this step three, whether to take responsibility or not. But beyond these like social relationships or social ties with either targets or, victims or perpetrators, it seemed it is also like critical for the bystanders to feel really motivated by some forms of their value systems or the morals, like basically doing the right thing, or like having some empathy for them. That to so,
So shifting then from whether to help, step four is how to help. This is consistent with our the framework that we're using. We find that not knowing what to do is really a significant obstacle. If you don't know how to intervene, it's really difficult to jump to the final step. One consideration here is that bystanders have to negotiate whether to confront the perpetrator directly or to take a more indirect approach. So, I mean, there's a lot of literature, as I'm sure many people on this call know, around common for instance, sexual assault. It's common that that this is a decision point in the process to becoming a bystander who actually intervenes. We do find that across our data, one consistency is that that many who are responding to anti-Asian discrimination largely navigate the uncertainties of this step without really consulting anyone else. So here is a quote from a white male who describes two different occasions, one when he intervened and another when he didn't. He says, during the time in the first one when I intervened, I was very motivated and passionate about what I was going to say. I didn't really have to think too hard about it, about what I was going to say. It would more roll off the tongue. He continues then and says that in the second scenario where I didn't act, my emotions were very, very different. I was feeling uncomfortable, and I guess I had a little bit of anxiety and stress. And I think that was due to being in public around other individuals, not feeling very safe in that situation. I didn't know these people out in public, and I felt super uncomfortable, and I didn't want to offend anyone with what I was going to say. So deciding how to help them is also hinges on how will the victim respond. So in that moment, respondents describe trying to assess whether how a given intervention is going to impact the victim. So, for example, one respondent said it was a tricky situation because I didn't want to make him more uncomfortable by making a big deal. I didn't really even know how to address it, and I didn't want to be like, that's racist, and then make a big deal out of something that might be less harmful than other forms of racism, I guess. Another respondent said, I didn't want to take away her autonomy, but I wouldn't have forgiven myself if I knew I could have stopped that guy in that moment. And then finally, I didn't know what to say, how to handle it. And then I ended up regretting not saying anything in the moment. But I was like, not my place, stuff like that. So it's in retrospect that respondents who we spoke with are able to more clearly analyze what that moment represented for them and how, in response to a situation that they maybe later more clearly identified as being a situation where they could have responded, and in hindsight, would reflect on how they could have responded. In the moment, it unfurls at a pace at which they are unable to come up with a very clear, definitive way to be able to help, and so they don't proceed, but some do.
So intervening was the final step one. So intervening often involves assessing the costs and benefits and making one final decision whether to act on it. So these costs ranged from like missing out, not receiving the tip, giving up the tip from customers, to disrupting friendship, or to lose a job. So one respondent described like how coworkers are making fun of a Asian customer's accent, and he intervened by telling them to go to learn another language. But he was very concerned that he could lose his job if he reacted too strongly. So he said, of course, it was a working environment. I didn't want to get fired. This was the most I felt I could do, but the perpetrator took the message. So nearly in most of the study respondents, our study was aware of some potential costs associated with intervention, but they like inter intervening. But for some respondents, the estimated cost of intervening can also was the reason they got stuck at step one. So they ended up not intervening when they were thinking about what to do the host. So one respondent said, if I say something, what will happen? Am I not going to be a part of the group anymore? Are they going to commit me? Another respondent said, oh, I just didn't want to create enemies as well, or I didn't want them to think that I was like that girl who always say the opposite of what everyone says. Because I feel like it wasn't like that. So some respondents were thinking at this fear of being called a social justice warrior or savior if they step in. Respondents who ended up intervening commonly reports that they feel happy, glad, or good for intervening. The positive feelings also connect back to the moral obligations that they have identified, basically to do the right thing in step three. So one respondent described that the positive effects of taking the action, even when there were no victim in the room. So the person said, well, I felt good because even though the target or the victim wasn't necessarily seeing or hearing what I was saying to defend them, me knowing that I did, it just shows my character and shows my morals, if that makes sense. Um, Additionally, also, all respondents who took action and intervened indicate that they feel more comfortable basically to do it again based on because they already have done it. So this paper, this project, we examined the process by which the bystanders to anti-Asian discrimination decided whether to act or not. So it was notable for us that both experiences of taking action or not taking action informed how the bystanders would respond to the similar situations in the future. So, so act of intervening increased the bystanders' confidence and desire to do it again. And even for those who didn't end up intervening, they also report that they would intervene or they would act different ways if they encounter similar situations in the future. So our data challenges a simple heuristic like binary dividing people by either they are racist or not racist because it is the process that they need to go through to decide whether to or not. So every respondent who intervened also has some examples of when they did not intervene, and each respondent reflected on what they learned from how this process is. The increase of high profile anti-Asian hate crime during the pandemic increased the awareness of the whole issues or the problems of anti-Asian discrimination or hate. But our findings suggest that awareness of anti-Asian racial discrimination on its own is not sufficient to motivate others to take action. So bystanders experience many frictions at every stage of the five-step processes for bystander intervention. And specifically, we found that step two, which is to identify the instance as an intervention appropriate, was the steepest point. We found that this point being step two being the most stickiest because bystander needed to determine whether what they were witnessing was really racially motivated or really was racial discrimination. So in some cases, the instance was ambiguous. However, we also found that bystanders were also driven by their own judgment, regardless of whether the victim indicates that they felt uncomfortable with feeling targeted. So even if the victim seemed not disturbed necessarily, or no other bystanders were standing up, they felt, many like bystanders felt that they compelled to respond because they felt uncomfortable or they thought like it was world wrong. So then like taking that responsibility was really, and like to do the right thing was a really key motivator for them to move to the next stage. Since our like, we found that like the step two is being able to recognize the instance as intervention appropriate, as the steepiest form for bystanders, I'd like to end this talk by introducing some common microaggression organization methods. Although like blatant forms of discrimination or crime can be relatively easy to detect in the moment, subtle forms of discrimination like microaggression can be difficult to tell in some contexts. So I thought it would be important to be aware of like this kind of some common subtle forms of microaggression moving along. Um, so some common microaggression experienced by Asian Americans are like being asked like, where are you really from? So this is like kind of similar to or related to the purpose for foreigners stereotype that constantly assume that all Asians are foreign and exotic. Or oh, you people always do well in school. We're all like smart, you're good at stats, or you're good at math, like that kind of like stereotype can also undermine individuals' effort to be able to do well in math or stats. Um, for assuming that like less verbal agents are often like perceived as lacking interest or disengaged or inattentive, or forcing them to conform to like some norm or values. Like all this, these are some examples, but like these are some of my mentions targeting Asian American stage game. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. So, and Dr. Roth and I will be happy to answer some of your questions. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank y'all so much. And I can go ahead and get us started with questions. As we've been talking about bystander intervention on our side, the idea of delegating has come up a lot where you kind of like recruit others to help in the intervention that you're doing. Is that something that came up in your study at all of people like wanting to see if other people in the room are also uncomfortable and then recruiting them in the intervention?
I don't recall any respondents reporting element when to remember anything.
Yeah, I don't remember that being an item that showed up in the stories that we heard from people. Um, and but it could be because we didn't ask. Um, I think it's also the case that most of the folks who talked about either scenarios where they intervened or where they chose not to, decided not to, um, they they really I mean, they tended to portray this as like a lot going on in their own mind in that moment to try to tease out a defensible interpretation of what is happening in front of them. They're drawing on like in a very knee-jerk kind of a moment. Okay, that was just said. Did I hear that correctly? You know what I mean? So there's just a lot of internal processing, and there was definitely gauging this kind of pluralistic inaction, looking to see whether anyone else was going to do anything, like reading the crowd to see if anyone is registering that something was amiss here. But I don't remember necessarily hearing this idea of a kind of what was the word that you used, Jenna?
Delegate.
Yeah, a really of delegating. Um, mhm.
Thank you. That's super interesting and really helpful for us, like on our side of things, as we're, doing education for students on the different approaches to bystander intervention. Thank you. And did this
But I
study
can,
bring up, oh, I see Anna Catherine has a question.
yeah, I can just see why how important that is in so many different bystander situations. And we were looking at a particular type of situation. And I think for a lot of bystanders in that moment when you have like 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 8 seconds, you feel really alone in that moment. You're like, okay, this feels fraught, and like there's so many swirling thoughts and considerations, provided that you even recognize that what just happened merits intervention to begin with. So, sorry, Anna Catherine, you had your hand up.
Anna Catherine, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
Maybe that was just like a hey. Whoops, okay. Whoops.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, mic issues. Okay. Okay.
You could put it, okay. You can put it in the chat if you want, as well if you had a question. I was just going to ask if this research has brought up like any additional questions or like other needs for research that y'all identified.
You want to take that on, Monkey?
Yeah, I think our the entire data was put from the bystander, but we didn't like necessarily put data from the target, the victims or the perpetrators. So even though we hope or the literature suggests that it would have influenced like perpetrators or it will like protect bystanders, the art victims, but empirically we didn't test that in our study. So I think it will be meaningful to like conduct like further study to that test like how the bystander intervention or whether the bystander intervention actually really like helps the victim or like actually is it actually like changing something in the perpetrators or what about other bystanders? So I think that's something that we like to explore that will be important to explore in the future studies.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that perspective would be really interesting to learn more about. Anna Catherine?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So one question I was going to ask is, did you see any kind of stereotypical responses from the folks you talked to? For example, did you find that perhaps men were ready to intervene in a physical way and women were prepared to verbally argue with people
Mm.
more often?
Hmm. That's a great question. I'm looking at you, Bongki.
Yeah, it's really great question. Well, I think that's something that we haven't necessarily explored. And but I think it's really interesting. And my recollection is that like it really depended on the situation or the types of incident. So we didn't see like clear pattern between like different children, say, but it seems to be more driven by the nature of the comments or who was the victim or who was the perpetrator. So, but I think like it's really interesting. It will be interesting to explore more. Ben, do you have anything to?
Well, I might say one other thing that rather than thinking about an attribute that the bystander carries with them that seemed to suggest a certain type of response that they tended toward, more what we were left thinking about is how bystander intervention begets bystander intervention. And often we would hear people say, "Oh yeah, in high school I had a situation where a friend of mine had something happen to them and I didn't do anything and I regret it to this day." So I determined at that point that I was not going to let another moment like that happen without saying something. So it sort of really points to the importance of social exposure I mean, in an indirect way. So having these were university students, and they would reference background experiences in high school. And it just made us appreciate how social exposure can contribute to a level of awareness that lays the foundation for the possibility of responding when witness to this kind of thing in college. So Bongki, I don't know if you would agree with that from what we saw. Again, it's a little bit the reason why Bongki and I or Dr. Wu, sorry, the reason why Dr. Wu and I are hesitating just a little bit to dive in on these questions is because we have a small sample, and so we want to be really careful not to be like, oh, yes, 60% of our of our respondents, So because I guess this goes back to Jenna's question earlier, which is what comes next, and really what should come next is a much larger study that allows us to draw on a bigger data set, enabling a different level of analysis than what we're capable of accomplishing with these data. But it's still these were some trends that showed up. I would say that personally, one of the things that was the hardest for me that Dr. Wu already alluded to is the sense of, for some respondents who described getting to stage 5 where they intervened, a sense that they had done the right thing, that by intervening in the way that they had done what was correct, morally obligated to do. And based on how they describe the situations, it was not altogether, I mean, like, you're left wondering as the reader, like, did the target really appreciate that intervention? And was it, going back to the one that we even opened with about the individual who described standing up for his Asian boss who owned the restaurant, did she appreciate that? Like, we just don't know. And what's interesting is that some of this, for the bystander at least, is in the service of reassuring themselves that they are, I don't know, acting in a moral way or standing up for what they believe to be right. And that can be true. And what can be true at the same time is that the thing that they did, the way that they intervened, the words that they said, didn't necessarily help the target. Didn't make them feel less victimized. That they're, and so I think, yeah, that was maybe one thing that I'm just left thinking about is the many layers here that are at work and really deciding, all right, well, what is effective bystander intervention in situations like this? Did you want to say anything about that, Bongki? I kind of went a little bit off script from what we wrote about in the paper, but that's more of a personal reflection.
And relate your question. I just thought that in our study we only included 20 people, so we cannot generalize anything. However, I think there were it seemed like bystanders' own social identities mattered too. Like we shared in a couple slides, bystanders of color in particular, they also needed to go through additional process of thinking about what it means for them. They were able to develop this empathy because they know what it is like to be discriminated. But then at the same time, they also needed to think about whether like by intervening, will they be also stereotyped, or will they also encounter some unfair labeling? So it seems to me our findings suggest that their identity, bystanders' own identities influence their intervention, or at least their success. So I just thought about this finding because since so I think it's possible that there can be some gender differences in the way they respond, but unfortunately our studies were not able to analyze that. But I really appreciate your question.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. I think that's a great way to end with those reflections. That
Thanks,
was
Jenna.
Really appreciated. Yeah, thank you all so much for your time today, Dr. Wu and Dr. Roth. That was really informative and aligned so well with the work that we've been doing, and always great to get some extra context that we can use in our presentations and conversations about bystander intervention that are happening around campus. I hope that y'all can join us next month. The coalition will be meeting again April 2nd at 3:30 p.m., and we're bringing in another guest speaker for that meeting over Zoom as always. Thank you all so much for being here, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks, Jenna.
Thank y'all.